Hey guys, welcome back. I'm super excited today to be talking about two pedals from a pedal company called ALABS. They are relatively new. They've got a couple of pedals out right now that are very budget friendly and really packed with great features. So the two that we're going to be talking about today are the Cetus Reverb and the Timeslip Delay. So like I mentioned, they're both very budget friendly. They both come in at right around $100, but they've got a lot of great features packed in. They're both stereo in and out. They have spillover. The reverb has pre-delay, which is a huge factor for me. Now, they both come loaded with a ton of algorithms. So today's video isn't necessarily going to be a deep dive, a deep demo into every single algorithm, because this would be a much longer video if that were the case. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to show you a couple of my favorite sounds, a couple of my favorite algorithms from each of these pedals, but what I really want to show you is how they interact with each other, because especially in the praise and worship space, it's very normal to be using delay and reverb together. So it's important to have a good pairing that really works well together. So let's kick it off by starting with the reverb, the Cetus Reverb. There's a lot of really cool functions with this, a lot of great algorithms. You've got kind of your standard stuff like your hall, you've got a room, spring, and plate, and you've got some other kind of more experimental sounds as well. And it does have kind of a cloud-esque, it's called cloudy, a cloud-esque style reverb, just like the Big Sky. So that's actually my favorite sound on here. We'll get to that here in a second, but here's just a couple of my favorite sounds so far. So first, let's take a look at the plate setting on here. I've got it dialed to a bit of a medium wash, but I feel like it's really nice and bright. It's definitely got that good level of wash without getting too in the way of the notes. Next, I've dialed in a pretty wet spring reverb, and I've tried out a lot of different reverbs that have kind of a hard time doing that drippy kind of surf rock spring style reverb, and I feel like this does it super well. So here's what that sounds like. Next, I want to look at the cloudy algorithm on here, which is ALAB's attempt to kind of emulate the cloud setting of the Big Sky, and I feel like they do actually a really good job with it. I've basically dialed in a very small reverb, which could kind of be like an always on kind of a thing, or a rhythm guitar type of thing. And then I've also dialed in a pretty washy kind of lead guitar tone. I would be really happy to use this as kind of like my standard go-to lead tone that just kind of needs a little bit more ambience and a little bit more wash to it. So here's what that sounds like. So you can hear this definitely covers a wide range of different sounds. You can get it nice and short and subtle to very long and ambient types of sounds. I'd mentioned this before, but just a couple things that I really love about it. It's definitely the spillover. So maybe even if you're using this in addition to another reverb pedal, if you bypass this and disengage it, those reverb trails are just going to keep going. But another thing I love on here is actually the bright knob on here. It's basically like a tone knob, so you can get this to be pretty dark or very bright. So I've tried a lot of other reverbs too that just have a bit of a hard time getting brighter. Sometimes I'm wishing I could get this to be a little bit brighter of a reverb sound, but I feel like this really gives you a wide spread of different EQ options to be able to dial this in the way that you want. Now let's move on to the Timeslip Delay, and this is really versatile. I am a big fan of this delay. It really does everything from kind of your standard workhorse delays like tape and analog, digital, but it gets really experimental with some of these as well. I'm a big fan of the reverse algorithm as well as the Granule. The Granule, you'll hear it in a little bit, but this is basically like having a microcosm or a mood, something that kind of style on your board that's a lot cheaper. But it does kind of give you some of those ambient, like very experimental, very interesting types of sounds. So let's start by taking a look at the tape algorithm. I'm a big fan of tape delay. That's always my go-to choice when it comes to dialing in just kind of a good standard delay. I like how crisp that it starts. You get kind of a nice bright repeat, but then it degrades pretty quickly. And I feel like this does it really well. So here's what that sounds like. Now the analog algorithm is actually really great on here as well. I've tried a lot of different delays that once you try to add in some of that classic Memory Man-esque warble and grit and just kind of modulation, it just doesn't really do it very well. And I'm a big fan of how this handles some of that modulation. And it also does a good job of giving you some of those really dark, gritty repeats. So here's what that sounds like. It definitely adds a lot of nice ambience, you know, when you crank up the repeats and it kind of creates that bed underneath your playing. It almost acts a little bit like a reverb too. And I meant to mention this as well. Using a cheaper delay like this with the analog setting could also be a great companion for one of your other delays if you want to stack delays together. Maybe you do an 1/8 setting with the analog sound and stack that with a dotted 1/8 tape on another delay. There's definitely a lot of cool options for using something like this. But like I mentioned a second ago too, there's some really cool experimental kind of odd sounds on here as well. So I want to take a look at the reverse setting on here. It's kind of exactly what it sounds like, but it's very musical. I'm finding it very inspiring playing with this. So here's what that sounds like. And I also had touched on the Granule setting a little while ago. It's very odd. It definitely kind of chops up your signal a little bit and spits it back out in different octaves. I noticed there's a bit of a higher octave as well as a lower octave, and the actual repeats get sort of chopped up like I mentioned. So very cool sounding. Let's take a look at how that sounds. So yeah, very experimental, very odd, but I'm finding that really inspiring as well, especially here in a second. Once we put them together, it sounds really wide and huge with some reverb behind it as well. But as far as the actual delay settings, you know, I mentioned a lot of my favorite things about this, but the fact that it's got one button and it still does tap tempo, I think is really great. The actual responsiveness as you're tapping it in too is very responsive. It catches on really quickly. And just like the reverb too, you get a lot of control over the parameters on here. So if you want to dial it in a lot brighter, a lot darker, if you want to add a lot of modulation or take a lot of it away, you have a lot of control at your fingertips in such a small package too. So Big fan of this. But like I mentioned before, I think they really do shine when you play with them together. I think the stereo spread of the delay and the reverb just creates this really huge sound. So here's what they both sound like together. So again, I'm really impressed by these for the price point. I think it's really hard to beat. You may be asking, who are these for? I think if you're just building a board for the first time, or you're definitely trying to build a very powerful, maybe even a stereo board on a budget, these are at the top of my list right now that I would recommend. I think they're really great for the low price point. Maybe you already have a great delay and a great reverb. I could also see these being great as a bit of a companion pedal to just stack with some of those for a little extra versatility if you need it. But really, I think if there's any downsides, I think the main thing that I don't love is that there's no presets. There's no way, especially with the reverb, there's no way to save any presets to access. That's definitely a big thing for me when I'm looking for a good reverb pedal. It kind of is what it is for $100, and for this footprint, you know, there's only so much that they can really pack into it. So I think that's the main thing for me that would definitely just elevate these even higher than they already are. But for the price, for the footprint, it's really hard to beat these. You might be curious though how these stack up to the Strymon Timeline and the Strymon Big Sky. And I break down all of my go-to sounds for both of those pedals in these videos right up here. So feel free to check those out if you want to see for yourself how they compare, and I will see you in the next one.